Good morning, Beverly Public Schools. We hope you have a wonderful day today. As you know, I'm Dr. Dorothy Flaherty, the Assistant Superintendent of Schools, and I'm here today to start off our wonderful day of learning together. We've made it to November, and that's because of all of the hard, wonderful work that you're all doing in your schools, and we're so appreciative of that. As we enter November, it is the month of gratitude as we work up towards Thanksgiving. And I first want to start the day by expressing the deep, deep gratitude that both Sue and I have for all of the hard work that you have all been doing in your schools during this very difficult time. As we walk through, the thing that stands out the most to us is the joy that our students are expressing and showing, and the smiles and just the love of learning. And they're just so happy to be back at school. So we thank you for all of your hard work. We hope that you each find some valuable learning today in the many different types of workshops and choice boards that we have available for you to look at. The Professional Development Committee did look at our feedback, and we hope that you recognize that we tried to incorporate some of that into today's options. Preschool wanted to have some learning just for the preschool level, and they will be having some training in responsive classroom, along with their paraprofessionals. We did have a request that paraprofessionals wanted some of their own specific training, and so they will also be working together for training in social emotional learning in the classroom and traumatic sensitive classrooms. For our middle school and high school, we will have a training on collaborative problem solving. We did get feedback that we wanted more SEL, mental health, and that workshop will also work in implicit bias as we work on moving towards our anti-racism theme for the year. Our elementary teachers will be getting Zern training, and it will be really a question and answer period so that you can ask what you need to know as we implement a new math program, which you've been doing an outstanding job with. We also wanted to make sure that we continued time for you to do your independent learning through choice boards, because that was a very popular part of our day back in days this year, back in September. And so you will have time to work on your choice boards. And for many of our non-instructional professional staff, such as our counselors, you wanted more time or more specific training for your work role. And so there is an option in the choice board for you to work together, either with colleagues or on your own, doing independent reading or research in an area that will be of interest to you. Our nurses will be doing SNAP training, and they will also be with us for this morning's all staff training with Dr. Morgan. Once you finish today, we'll be finished around 1 o'clock. It's an earlier end than we had in the fall. Then please, if you haven't already taken the time, take the chance to go out and vote. It's a very important day, and this is a day for us to all express our choice and our vote and our voice. So please do so if you haven't already. And at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce to you our newest member of the Beverly Public Schools team. He will be delivering our keynote address today as we continue our work to make our schools inclusive and reflective of all of our population and demographics, and as we grow and start our knowledge in anti-racism in our community. So it is now my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Andre Morgan.
Thanks, Dr. Flaherty. Good morning. I trust everybody is doing well. I'm Andre Morgan. I came on board a few weeks ago as the Director of Opportunity, Access, and Equity. I think my role is really multifaceted yet exciting because I get the opportunity to focus on 3 distinct areas. But before I start, let me just recognize a few folks this morning. Dr. Chirocek for the opportunity to join this community. Dr. Flaherty for making the work of equity a very pivotal focus, not just in terms of professional development, but just as a model that the district is going to move towards. To each of the central office staff, to the principals and the heads of the different schools. This includes the assistant principals, to the department heads, to the school staff, to the teachers, paraprofessionals, lunch folks, nurses, custodians. Thank you for making me feel welcome. Those folks who I've had an opportunity to connect with over the course of the last few weeks. To the technology and BevCam teams, thank you for your help with this project and all of the other projects I'm going to have the gumption to ask you to assist with over the course of the next days, weeks, months, hopefully years together. Now, before I tell you about what brought me to this work, one of the BevCam team members challenged me to tell a joke this morning. Yeah. Now, jokes aren't my thing, but I'm going to try nonetheless. So here we go. Yesterday, I saw a guy spill all of his Scrabble letters on the road. I asked him, what's the word on the street? All right, so I'm working on the joke thing. But what I'm going to do today is go through a couple of different things. One, I want to talk about the definitions of my new role. Second, I want to talk about the 4 eyes of oppression. And then I'm going to follow that with a case study that involves a teacher and a student. And then I'm going to go into microaggressions, and that's going to follow by an overview of the school debrief. And so let me tell you about me and my why. In my course and in my journey with education, in the early part of my career, I was a high school teacher. I was young. I had this I'm going to change the world mentality. And then once I got into the classroom, I really saw it. I saw the opportunity and the achievement gaps that are so pervasive across the education spectrum. I saw a system that asked teachers to maintain it and not necessarily disrupt it. And as I moved into school leadership roles, I realized that principals really didn't have a way to think about cultural relevance. And they were expected to deal with that on top of all the other expectations for schooling. So now that I had seen it, I wanted to get a systemic look at the problem and then disrupt it. It wasn't just the teachers. It wasn't just the principals. It wasn't just the superintendents. It wasn't just the state. It was the system itself. And certain groups of students that were in this system were never going to rise up. And I wanted to disrupt the system because kids who look like me, I wanted them to be able to see their own utopias so they could feel belonging and relevance, so they can see themselves represented in classrooms, so they can feel successful regardless of the hues of their skin. So there'd be no colorism. So there'd be no imposter syndrome. So there wouldn't be any self-hate. We could just learn and appreciate difference when all we've done was been taught to fear it. And so as I began looking at the system from one lens, I couldn't help but take a look at it from other lenses. Students who don't speak English as a primary language, I begin to see it from their lens. Can you imagine what it's like to have to float back and forth between two languages, one at home, one at school, and then deal with all of the dynamics that surround that? I also saw students who had some type of disability. And it wasn't that they were less capable in any way, shape, or form. They just happened to have an issue that other students did not. And then I saw students in poverty, who include the demographics I just mentioned. And so now a lot of these students have two strikes against them because these subgroups fall into several categories. Can you imagine what that feeling is like? So here's the time when I get to tell you what I think I'm supposed to do. Aside from dealing with the issues of opportunity, access, and equity, and ensuring civil rights, particularly for my students and families in the public school community, in addition to dealing with safety issues, and a plethora of other things that surround these areas, I think the thing that I would tell you is that I'm not here to fix all of those problems. I'm here to help disrupt it. And so when I think about disruption, I think about this ladder that's behind me. And so, I've learned in my journey that if you're ever going to climb something and ascend to heights, and some of you might be a little fearful of heights, but you can't talk about safety and you can't talk about doing things in a safe manner without charting a little bit of unweathered territory. So listen, this is what I want you to do. Now, by nature, I'm an adventure sports person. So I have no problems going up ladders. I have no problems jumping out of planes. I have no problems with any type of height measurement. And so when I think about disruption, I think that if you're looking at it in terms of a ladder, you've got to be willing to go up the ladder. And so I can't stand at the bottom and say, I want the colleagueship of the Beverly community to join me as we start talking about anti-racism and belongingness and inclusion and diversity and meeting the needs of diverse students. And I don't model that behavior and go up. So today I want you to go up the ladder with me. And so as we're going up, certainly it could be a little fearful sometimes in our journey, but I choose not to be afraid, and I don't want you to be afraid either. We're going up the ladder together. And if we're really going to tackle these issues of systemic racism, if we're really going to deal with the students who really need our full capacity, then we've got to go up the ladder. It's a little nerve-wracking sometimes because there might be some bumps in the road. We might lose our footing and fall back a little bit. But if we're going up together, we can at least catch each other so we don't hit the ground. But the alternative is we do nothing and we stay at the bottom of the ladder. So today, I'd like you to lean in to what we're talking about. I'd like you to kind of push yourselves a little bit. I'm even going to challenge you because I know at 8 o'clock in the morning, and especially on live streams, that it's tempting to kind of walk away from the computer and to do other things. But I'm going to ask you to stay with me this morning because I think that there's some information that can all benefit that can benefit us all as we move towards a better community. Disruption means that we have to go up the ladder. It means that we stay on the ladder, we stay engaged, but it's a journey and it's one that I'm excited about. So I look forward to my work with each of you and partnering with you over the course of the days, the weeks, and the months and the years ahead. So let's look at our goals for today. We have a few things that we're going to achieve. And Judy, if you will take me to the next slide. We want to foster connections that support and challenge one another while holding conversations on race, racism, and equity. This is the part of the understanding the systems that we're going to focus on. And so by the end of our time together, we want to build relational trust in a community that really builds an understanding of what it means to feel like you're on the looser side of things. I want to talk about oppression. I want to talk about how that makes students feel. And then we want to understand micro and macro aggressions. I'm going to throw a shameless plug out here for a minute because later on this afternoon, we get to do some choice boards. And I'm going to do a choice board that focuses on doing a deeper dive into micro and macro aggressions. I'm going to talk about some things with that, but then we're also going to role play because here's what I understand, that there's a real need to talk about these issues so that we can get better at addressing them. I want to go back a slide for a minute because I want you to keep the ladder in your mind this morning. As we talk about some things, it's not going to land well for some of you. And some of you, it might be a difficult conversation. But I think what makes it difficult is when we choose not to address it, when we choose not to talk about it. And when we pretend, it'll just simply go away and we can just sweep it under the carpet. It's not what we want to do this morning. This is not a shame or blame game. What this is a space and an opportunity for care and compassion so that we all just grow in our knowledge around this issue. Keep that in mind. We're going up the ladder together. And in our partnership and our collaboration, we're going to keep ascending so that we can be the best resource for kids such that they become better tomorrow than they are today. But it's not just about kids, it's about adults as well. Because you are pivotal in making sure that the dreams and the aspirations of students get achieved across the span of their lives. And so it's for both adults and students. Our hope is that by the end of this session, we'll be able to do the three things that you see on the screen. And of course, it doesn't end with a 90-minute session. Of course, we don't become experts after this time together, but we become experts as we continue to engage in the work. So, this is what I want to do. I want to start defining some terms because I think that district alignment becomes really important. But before we jump into district alignment, I want to put some housekeeping rules on the table. One, I want you to feel free to type your questions in the chat. And so I think I can see most of the questions as you're typing them in. Thank you for your comments. To those who are already putting some things into the chat. One of the things I also want you to do is to be able to ask questions as well. For me, there's no such thing as a silly question. The only silly question is the one that you have that you don't ask. Again, this is a space where no one is blamed, where no one is shamed. But I want to start with some definitions because I think aligning the district with the definitions of opportunity, access, and equity will go a long way in helping us to address these inequities. All right, so again, the title is Director of Opportunity, Access, and Equity, but what do those terms really mean? On our slide, I'm sure some of you have seen some variation of this slide in some way, shape, or form. Two different scenarios, one on the left, the other on the right. It's pretty clear that on the left, there's an inequity, but on the right, that inequity is corrected. You'll notice on the left that every student gets the same thing. That's the access piece of the job. It means that on the right, one student is given more blocks in order to provide the access point. So here's the difference. Quality correlates to access, and it means giving everyone the same resources. Equity means giving each student access to the resources that they need to learn and thrive. Opportunity are those things that we do in order to close achievement gaps. And so again, opportunity, what we do to close achievement gaps, access, how we give resources to every student, and then equity is giving each student access to the resources that they need, which means that while I might need one set of resources, somebody else needs a different set. Equity further focuses on closing the opportunity gaps that I just mentioned. And it also means fighting implicit bias. It means recognizing that the power imbalances exist within both historical and modern contexts of race, ability, gender, financial background, and even the way somebody was raised. And then accounting for all of these differences in order to improve the education in daily life for the maximum number of students. And this means accounting for and better supporting individual differences, because some students really do need additional attention, and allowances to overcome setbacks in their personal life and in these long-standing systems of oppression. So I want to start with a game this morning. And I'm going to play that game with the folks who are here with me. And for those of you who are watching, I know we have quite a number, and I'm not going to ask everybody to key in their thoughts, but if some of you feel compelled, go ahead and jot your thoughts down into the chat. So I'm going to give a question, and I want you to tell me the first thing that comes to mind. And this is for all the folks who are in the room. I have my friend Judy Miller with me today, who is going to help me monitor the chat. And Judy, if you will key in the responses that you hear to these 3 prompts. When I say prison, what is the first thing that comes to mind? When I say prison, what is the first thing that comes to mind? Thoughts? To my friends who are sitting around me, what comes to mind?
Loss of freedom.
All right, so loss of freedom. Bars, barbed wire. All right, mass incarceration. Crime. Addiction. So let me ask a more pointed question. What kind of people do you see? I see profit. So when I say prison, what kind of people come to mind? Young black man. Boys. Men. People of color. Thanks for those of you who are keying into the chat. Poor. Black men without representation, minorities, hopeless, criminals. So listen to this. Did anybody think Martha Stewart? Martha went to prison. And here it is, a white woman with privilege and also influence and affluence. But no one thought about Martha. So let's try something else. When I say basketball, who do you think of?
Larry Bird.
Larry Bird. I like Larry too. Michael Jordan. Kobe Bryant. All right, other thoughts. So we got Larry, we got Kobe, we got Michael. Yeah, we got Michael Jordan coming up on the chat. LeBron James. Tall guys. All right. So here's the interesting thing. Many of you saw men, but did anybody think about the U.S. Paralympic women's wheelchair basketball team? Did anyone see a non-able-bodied person shooting hoops? So these are things that we've been taught to believe, and it's part of a system of oppression. And here's the problem that I've noticed. We're afraid to now have conversations around race, racism, and systems of oppression. But if we're going to disrupt the system, we should be talking about it. We should be able to come to the table and have a conversation, even if we get up from the table and we're still not thinking the same way. And so a friend of mine likes to tell this story when introducing the topic of oppression. And so now we're moving from our definitions into the 4 eyes of oppression. There's this fox that likes fish, and the fox likes to talk to the fish. So once a week, the fox goes to the pond to have a conversation with them. So the fox goes to the pond and says, "Yo, fish, what up?" Fish says, "Hey, fox." Fox says, "How are the rocks?" Fish says, "The rocks are great. They make the bottom of the pond look natural." So the next week, fox goes back to the pond. "Hey, fish, what up?" Fish says, "Hey, fox." Fox asks, "How's the sun?" Fish says the sun is nice because it puts algae on the pond.
So this goes on for another couple of weeks. Then the fox comes back and says, "Hey, fish." Fish comes up. "What up, fox?" Fox goes back and says, "Hey, how's the water?" Fish says, "What water?" That's exactly what oppression is. It's what we've been taught, such that we don't even recognize what the water is. It's the thing that exists that we don't really see. And that's why conversations about race and racism, which are two different things, become really uncomfortable. But perhaps in order to have impactful conversations, we should understand the systems of oppression. So there's this idea called the 4 eyes of oppression. They're an inner relationship, if you will. And so I want to unpack this just for a couple of minutes. And it starts with ideology or ideological oppression. Again, this is an interrelationship. And first, in any oppressive system at its core, there's the idea that one group is better than another group and has the right to control that group in some way, shape, or form. The idea gets elaborated in many ways. This person is more intelligent, harder working, stronger, and more capable. So I want to put a sidebar here because I see something in the chat asking if someone can close the blind so that the sun isn't in my face. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, it's coming into a side window and there's no shade.
All right. So, Tatisha, I'm going to move over just a little bit. Thanks for bringing that up. I'm in front of a window, a side window that has no shade. And so we're going to try to make an adjustment as I'm rolling through the 4 eyes of oppression. Over. So this might be a little better. Wonderful. So as we're talking about the ideological piece of this, it's the idea that one group is somehow better than another, and in some measure has the right to control the other group. And the idea gets elaborated in several ways. I gave the example a couple seconds ago about someone being more intelligent, harder working, stronger, more capable, more noble, more deserving, more advanced, and so forth. And the dominant group holds this idea about itself. And then, of course, the opposite qualities are attributed to other groups. That person is stupid, they're lazy, they're dumb, they're incompetent, they're worthless, they're deserving, they're backward, they're inferior, abnormal, and so on. So that's the ideological approach. It's what we're taught to believe and behave towards other people. Then we have institutional oppression, and the idea that one group is better than another group, can control that group. This is why it's an interrelational model, because they expand themselves as you move around the spectrum. But then how you treat people and what you believe about people is embedded in the institutions of society, into our laws, into the legal system, into police practice, into the education sector, into our schools, in the hiring policies, in the public policies, in the housing, in the media images, in the political power, and so forth. And so here it is, when 1 out of every 4 Black young men is currently in jail or on parole or on probation, it's institutionalized because it's supported by the laws and the institutions of society. Then we have interpersonal oppression. And it's the idea, starting from ideology, that one group believes that they're better than another group. It gets embedded into the institutions of society. And then now, as part of the interpersonal piece, individual members of the dominant group personally disrespect or mistreat individuals in the oppressed group. Well, now we're on to our internalized piece, because once the ideology occurs, the institutionalized piece of it occurs, the interpersonal piece occurs. Now we have the internalized formula. And the fourth way oppression works is when groups of people who suffer the most from the mistreatment. Oppressed people internalize the ideology of inferiority. They see it reflected in the institutions. They experience disrespect interpersonally from members of the dominant group. And then they eventually come to internalize the negative messages about themselves. So if we've been told that we're stupid or we're worthless or abnormal, and we've been treated like that all of our lives, then it's not surprising that ultimately people come to believe that. So oppression always begins from the outside, and then it begins to loom its way into the oppressed groups on the inside. And by the time it gets internalized in this model, the external oppression need hardly be felt for the damage to have already taken place. And so when we talk about the four eyes of oppression, here are some of the things and the terms that we're referring to. And so I want to talk about the ideological piece first and then work my way up from there. The ideological piece talks about race. Talks about racism, privilege, including white privilege, white supremacy, systemic oppression, structural racism. And all of these particular terms mean something a little slightly different. So I want to unpack them just for a minute. When we talk about white privilege, we're talking about rights that belong primarily to white people. It's being able to walk into a store and find that the main displays of shampoo or pantyhose are catered towards a particular hair type or skin tone. It's being able to turn on the television and see people of your race widely represented. It's being able to move through life without being racially profiled or unfairly stereotyped. When we talk about privilege, it's just a special right that people have. When we talk about race and racism, race is a construct. But then when we talk about racism, that is something that we have the ability to really shift and change our mindsets around. And so now I want to talk about the institutional piece, because those are the explicit and the implicit policies and practices. I think more inherently, what are some of the practices institutional that we might find in our own schools? It could be such things as the master schedule or bell schedule, things that dictate how time is to be managed and the time frame in which students are to get exposed to content and master that content. And then we realize on the tail end that there's a problem with student learning because we put them in an institutional box. And so the interpersonal piece deals with the macro and the microaggressions. I'm going to talk about this after the case study. And then the internalized piece, that includes the biases that we face and that we deal with. It includes the impression that I just talked about. It includes the water that we hold and that we move by in our day-to-day living. So I want to put a pause there, and certainly we welcome your comments and questions as I'm talking. But now I want to shift to a case study. I like case studies because I like the practical application. I will be honest and tell you that I didn't write this case study, but it's one that I think has some applicability as we talk about the four eyes of oppression. Now, I already recognize that you can't see this case. And so I'm going to read the case and I'm going to go through it a little more slowly. And so for those of you who are interested in the case and unpacking it a little later on, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to share it with you. but this is the case. Samantha, a vivacious seventh grader at Hillside School, a middle school in a predominantly low-income community, loves science class. By all apparent accounts, Samantha has a gift for the sciences too. She aces all of her quizzes and her tests, and she helps classmates who are struggling with experiments. However, things have changed since the start of COVID. Samantha hasn't been turning in homework, and she hasn't been doing this for over 2 months. And she continues to log in for her daily classes. She logs into the portal, the dashboard, and yet nothing is ever turned in. Her teacher, Ms. Grady, struggles to understand why Samantha rarely turns in her homework and is beginning to wonder if there's an issue at home. In their Zoom calls for class, Samantha's home always seems to look in order. And Ms. Grady has never seen anything bad happening when looking behind her students while on Zoom. Ms. Grady has touched base several times with her colleagues who have Samantha's younger siblings in their classes to see whether they were noticing similar patterns. To the contrary, she learned that her younger siblings always turn in their homework. Ms. Grady has reached out to Samantha every way she knows how, from pleading with her to offering to give her more advanced work that might engage her in new ways. On several occasions, she has asked Samantha why she rarely turns in her homework. "It's nothing," Samantha typically responds. "I'll do it next time, I promise." But regardless of how often she calls Samantha's parents, nobody answers. Imagine how successful Samantha could be if only her parents cared enough to support her education. Ms. Grady has often thought this several times to herself. As a conscientious teacher, Ms. Grady really does want to support Samantha. On the other hand, she has a screen full of other students who also need her attention. And when it comes down to it, Ms. Grady's grading policy is clear. Students are allowed to turn in one homework assignment 1 day late without penalty. So for my friends who are writing this morning, here it is. The policy says students are allowed to turn in one homework assignment 1 day late without penalty. And so Ms. Grady calls this her life happens rule. But in every other instance, failure to turn in homework results in a grade of 0 for the assignment. So one day after the class hangout, Ms. Grady calls Mr. Burns, a social studies teacher at Hillside, who had taken a particular interest in Samantha during the previous academic year. "I know," Mr. Burns says, "brilliant young woman. I had the same experience with her. I didn't know what to think until I decided to pay her family a visit at home." Having grown up in the area and attended Hillside as a low-income student, Mr. Burns bristled at some of his colleagues' deficit-laden perception of the local community. It never occurred to Ms. Grady to socially distance visits to Samantha's home or to find other ways to reach her family during such an uncertain time. "Wow," she responds, taken aback by her colleagues' direct action approach to student success. "What did you learn?" Mr. Burns says, "I learned a lot," explaining that Samantha's father finally found a steady job 4 months after he was laid off from the local mill due to COVID-19. However, he's an essential worker now and will be cleaning nightly. Samantha's mother continues to piecemeal jobs together. She usually comes home around 11 p.m., an hour or so after her husband, trying not to wake the kids. So Mr. Burns continues to explain Samantha's home life to Ms. Grady. From the moment she gets off the school hangout screen thing until her dad returns from work, She's babysitting Francis and Kevin, her younger siblings. She's busy taking them to the playground, cooking dinner for them, and helping them with their homework. Well, Miss Grady reflects, that explains why her siblings' homework is always in on time and how well Samantha does helping her classmates with their work. Now, all I have to do is figure out what to do about Samantha's grade. And I wonder, Miss Grady thinks to herself, how many of my other students are in similar situations. And so what I'd like to do at this time is just talk briefly about the 4 I's of oppression in this case study. And then a question to the viewing audience. What do Miss Grady's thoughts have you considering for your own planning in supporting teachers, in your colleagues, in your instruction? So let's take a look at the 4 I's as it relates to this case study. From an ideological perspective, and I want to go back a minute in the screen. Perhaps Mrs. Grady's mindset that's ideological is that parents don't care because they're not involved. And how many of us have ever thought that when we don't see parents come for parent-teacher night, or to come in for a conference, or to come to the school to talk to the teacher or to the department head or to the counselor about something that happened either that day or prior to? From an institutional standpoint, we have this grading policy that Miss Grady has mentioned a couple of times in the case study, that students can turn in one assignment 1 day late. It's her life happens policy. But what if life happens continuously? Does the policy stay the same? Or do you reimagine what that policy could look like? From an interpersonal standpoint, Ms. Grady could be thinking, I don't know what to do about her grade, but if I'm adhering to the policy, which is supported by my school administration and by my district, then, I'm going to give her a 0 for this assignment. Her aptitude doesn't match the 0, but hey, that's what the policy is. That's the interpersonal piece. And then the internalized piece could be from both angles, but from Samantha's lens, the internalized piece is, this teacher knows that I can do the work. She knows I'm talented. She knows I know science. I like science. I've told her this. But every time she reaches out to me, she's asking me when I'm going to turn in assignments. It's all I can do just to be on a Zoom call every day. I've got to care for a younger brother and sister. I've got to make sure they're attending their classes. I've got to make sure they're fed. I've got to make sure that all the provisions are in place. And every time I talk to this lady, she's asking me where my assignments are. I mean, I'm even showing an effort because I'm helping my classmates master the content. So that's the internalized piece. Doesn't necessarily matter that Miss Grady has reached out several times, but it's the messages that Samantha has internalized about what's coming from Miss Grady. Does she see a level of push and support? Or does she just see somebody hounding her about a grade for the sake of filling up a grade book? This is how oppression begins to manifest in our instruction, and it's systemic. And so again, our goal is, how do we disrupt the system so that more kids have a fair shake at a leveling playing field? Samantha's experience is certainly not going to be synonymous to a lot of other students. The average student, as we think about the average student, the one that has supporting parents, the one who has a parent who can come in at any time of the day, the one who is taking care of all provisions, the one household that doesn't have an issue that Samantha's family might be facing. From an internalized perspective from Ms. Grady, it could be the exact opposite. I'm spending all this time reaching out, and yet this student is not responding. I've given her multiple opportunities to turn in assignments. She still doesn't do it. So why should I keep doing what I'm doing? And so now you've got a frustration that's building up on both sides when there's nothing but good intent that hasn't been yet communicated. So I want to talk about a couple of the gaps for a minute. One gap is that Ms. Grady, until she talks to Mr. Burns, doesn't necessarily consider the lived realities that directly impacts this particular student. Lived realities such as the ability to access remote learning, including Wi-Fi access. Every family might not have a hotspot. They might not have the ability to have internet access. How about device access? Device sharing, device functionality, access to private space in the house, access to a quiet space, and considerations for the home expectations that are placed on Samantha, especially as she has to care and take care of a younger brother and sister. And so, based on this case study, does Ms. Grady consider how to meet Samantha where she is? I think that's the question that we all ask ourselves as practitioners. Do we meet students where they are? And that's where this whole opportunity, access, and equity component comes into play. Can we reimagine our practices and the ways that we do things in order to begin closing achievement gaps? Are we ensuring that all students have access to the resources that we're providing? Then from an equity standpoint, two things. One, are we giving every student what they need to be successful? And are we dealing with the biases that we have about subgroups? That's the two-tiered model. And so as you begin to think about this case study, let's think about our own work. And that's not an indication or an indictment that everybody is doing the same thing. This is just something to make us say, aha, where are the areas where we can reimagine the way that we do things? Where are the pieces that can change the institutional things that we see in our practices? How can we change the ideological piece of it such that it then affects institutional policies? Are we looking in the mayor daily, and this is me included, about the interpersonal piece? How do those biases reflect on those with a difference? Then the internalized piece. How are students internalizing our actions, our instruction, our relationships with them? And so just a little something to say, I wonder. So we're going to take a couple of questions. If there are any that you have, again, feel free to key them right into the chat. Sounds good. So I am sliding back because we want to get this sun issue under control. Thank you much. All right, questions, comments. So the chat isn't just for your questions, it's also for your comments as well, and reflections. That also includes questions and comments from our sitting audience too. All right. So let's see if we can address some of the comments. And Judy, if you will hit the arrow for new comments for me. So I want to share some of the things that I'm seeing in the chat. Thanks, Patricia. We need to adapt our policies to be more personal and case by case. Tisha says, I was just thinking the same thing, Gal. Elizabeth says, when my mom and aunt were teachers 20 years ago. And Judy, if you'll go back up a little bit. When my mom and aunt were teachers 20 years ago, home visits were the norm. And Janet shares, if she's attending the Zoom conference, why not ask her the homework questions at the time for our oral presentations and answers? And so some of you are starting to really reimagine what this could have looked like. But just think, this case study was actually adapted from a live situation in another district. And so, we see a few more comments, and thank you all for just sharing them, keeping in mind that a lot of kids are learning at home without parents in the house, that are also not able to receive their 501 accommodations, without the information. Thanks, Jennifer, for sharing that. Lisa notes, without the information, it's very difficult and unfair to make assumptions. Then Marianne notes that this just speaks to the real need to meet students where they are and just get rid of the notion of where we think they should be. And so, on that note, there's a lot of truth to that. But it also means that we have to reimagine the way that we do things and not get so embedded in what we've become used to that we can't think outside of the box, and we can't think about ways to spur student achievement and close achievement gaps. Catherine says, I think we also need to broaden our measures of achievement. Many kids have skills that are being undervalued by the narrow expectations of the school setting. And so I want to appreciate you, all of you, for all of your great points as we're looming through the chat and seeing some of the things that are really beginning to resonate with you. And I trust that some of these ideas that you're sharing in the chat, you will take into your school debrief, because the question that I'm going to leave you with which is going to spur your school debrief discussion today, is really going to set the tone for how you begin to move forward, not just in your classrooms, but in your schools. And Judy, let's take a few more comments. I'm going to scroll down because I want to see if there are any questions that if you hold on for 1 second. Mark Harrison gives us one question. I totally agree with making teaching personal and understanding each child's situation. However, how does that work with overall class expectations? Just wondering. And so I think part of it, Mark, is really beginning to look at it from a collaborative approach. That's one recommendation. I think as you're looking at really working with an entire group of students, yes, it's time consuming to personalize learning for each individual student. But you will find that as you begin to set up personalization styles and begin to develop different collaboratives, that could look different in your school, then you'll find that becomes a little bit of an easier task. And that's certainly something that's worth bringing up in your debrief in about 30 minutes or so. Samantha follows up with a question: how can we change policies to hold students accountable, but also give them opportunities to show us their understanding? I'm going to take kind of like a step outside of the box. Have you ever asked students how they think about it, or solicited student voice about what would be a measure of accountability? It's interesting because as I've met students in the last couple of weeks, many of them have some interesting perspectives about what they like to see in their learning environment. This was without my prompting in any way, shape, or form, just a meet and greet. Hey, how are you? But then that listening piece and listening for student voice really kind of opened up some ideas. So I always encourage students, make your voices heard, make them known, because teachers can't fix it and they can't adjust it if you're quiet. Do we have any other questions? And Judy, if you will scroll down a little bit. I want to make sure we hit as many of our questions as possible.
It's questions about not being able to make home visits and having access to the information, more personal information about students. I think I've seen a few people mention that.
So to that end, I want to share something that works generally a lot of the time. Interestingly, in the last couple of weeks, I had an opportunity to connect with a couple of parents. One particular parent had called me, and it wasn't a complaint more so than it was an introduction, if you will, a welcome to the Beverly community, and then kind of a dive into, all right, here's where my son is, here are my concerns. But I invited him to come in and sit with me. And so I think that, in cases where parents are sometimes often hard to reach, part of reaching them is a relational trust issue. And if I've had a bad experience with a teacher before, or if I invited a teacher into my space and that teacher violated that trust and there was a bad outcome as a result, then I might not be as trusting. And so I believe that being relational is the key to really opening up that door to parents who might seem like they're a little distant or they're hands off, or it might appear that they're not really interested in your connections or your reach out, but they really are. They just need the relational piece. I don't think that there's a magic bullet for being relational with people. I think you've got to feel that out based on initial conversations, based on what you've seen, based on actions, based on what you know. And while you don't have all the information, I think changing the mindset to be a little more relational will oftentimes open the door with parents. Catherine asked, will diversity in hiring be part of your role in the system? An interesting question. While my role is not HR related, I do think I'll have the capacity to make recommendations and suggestions about how our practices could potentially adjust in this district. I feel supported by the superintendent and the assistant superintendent to make those kinds of recommendations. I've interfaced with the HR team. And so, yeah, that's probably where my contribution can be. So in addition to that idea about disruption, to disrupt that practice in that area too. And so when I see something, to call it out, which I think is a mandate for all of us. When we see something that doesn't quite yet jive in the right way, it's incumbent upon us to call it out and bring it to the table so that something could be done about it. All right, I'm just making sure.
Nadi had a question.
All right.
How will your role support Beverly Public Schools in examining structures of oppression and racism within their own systems?
So Nadia, I think that's a pretty intensive question. So let me just unpack it. Quite honestly, I think my role is going to support Beverly Public Schools in a number of different ways. With the city of Beverly, with stakeholders in the city, having a mindset and an understanding and being on top of civil rights and Title IX legislation, being upfront on being abreast of the new changes, making sure that families are aware of these legalities, making sure that as I'm going through and I'm seeing inequities arise, that I don't just sit back in an office chair and let it slide and hide it under some paper, but quite honestly, to bring it to fruition, to bring it to the light, no matter how challenging that might be. I will also share with you, I guess I'm sharing for the whole group now, that one of the things I'm working on in addition to the meeting and greeting of the team across all of the Beverly schools is working on an equity audit. Part of the face-to-face conversations with stakeholders will inform what's shared in the audit, but also looking at the data about the district, data sets that perhaps we haven't paid, perhaps data sets that we can pay more attention to is what I'm looking at. Data that is disaggregated by race and gender. Data that really looks at the whole student. Data that really pulls apart and peels the onion back on inequities. So yeah, that's something that I'm working on. How will it inform the district? Well, hopefully, once we get an idea of where we are, where we're sitting in this space, then we can begin to prioritize how we can tackle and develop action plans in order to implement some innovations that will help hopefully change the course for many students. Can school departments arrange to meet with you virtually? Of course, I am welcome, I am open, and excited to do so. And that partnership is, I think, where we really go in order to stay up the ladder and keep moving forward. So Zachary, yes, please feel free to reach out. Melissa says, would you be able to talk to students in groups classes? Yes, and I actually already have. And we'll be doing a little more of that. In fact, I'll be joining the high school team on Friday to talk with some students about a reading by Maya Angelou, which was integrated into the curriculum. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And so, yes, I am completely open because I think that student voice, I think that partnership with me and you is going to go a long way in us changing the tide, a long way in terms of dealing with any types of inequities that might arise. All right, so I think we will handle some more questions a little later after our last session. I know we have about 28 minutes left, and I want to get to our final section, which is dealing with micro and macro aggressions. In U.S. workplaces across the country, people are finally engaging in real conversations about race and equity, about justice, about diversity, about equality, about inclusion. And you know what? I think that that's a great thing. And hopefully we're paving the way for some meaningful anti-racist action from both individuals and organizations. But those discussions, quite honestly, friends, they're going to be uncomfortable. And this is the thing that I think is holding us back in some regards, because as you look at what's happening across the country, in the prior years, even in the current day, we're now afraid to have conversations about race. They've become scary. They've become something that we wish would just go away. We can deal with every other aspect, but we don't want to deal with difficult conversations. I will share with you that families are interested in you having difficult conversations. They're interested in hearing your perspective. They're interested in you helping them to talk about and grapple with this issue with their young people. And so when we talk about microaggressions and macroaggressions, it always links to that conversation. It always links to difficult conversations around race. So let me tell you what they are. Microaggressions. All right, let me go back. I'm going to go into microaggressions first, and then I'm going to go back a slide into our learning from the 4 eyes of oppression. With microaggressions, these are incidences where someone accidentally or purposely makes an offensive statement, or they ask an insensitive question. Microaggressions are defined as verbal, they can be behavioral, or even environmental, and they can communicate derogatory or negative racial slights and an insult to the person that it's being made to. So for people of color, they are across daily work and life. And here are a few statements that I'm just going to share with you in terms of microaggressions. Again, this is not a blame or shame, but I do want you to be aware of any statements or thinking that you might be making for which you wonder can sometimes get misinterpreted by your students and families. Statements like, when I see you, I don't see color. And it signals that the person doesn't acknowledge that there are racial differences between you. Or it acknowledges that, well, hey, I won't hold it against you. And hearing it from that lens, perhaps, can you understand how it might land incorrectly with some? Here's another example. We are all one race, the human race. I've actually heard that one before. And it signals that, for me, that my experience as a Black person really is no different than the experience of people from other races. Or how about everyone can succeed in society if they work hard enough? Signal that the outcomes for people of color are usually the result of their own laziness. And so while I never believe that microaggressions, by and large, are intentional, I think that microaggressions do become harmful. And so if you look at this slide that I'm showing on the screen, it has microaggressions on the left-hand side and macroaggressions on the right. Macroaggressions are a little more in your face. They're intentional. Microaggressions, these are some of the statements that are made that tries to sidestep the racial disparity. But what it really does is ignores it, and it doesn't hold it into an important context. You may not be able to see this particular screen, but as we look at microaggressions, if you start at the top left of the quadrant, you see microaggressions, covert racism, and intentional. So some of the examples that I just shared can veer on unintentional. I'm sorry, some of the examples I didn't share could be on the intentional piece of it. The intentional piece could be something like, I believe all people of color come from poor backgrounds. That's intentional. Unintentional, which you see in the bottom left quadrant, are a couple of the examples that I mentioned prior to. When I see you, I don't see color, or everyone can succeed in society if they work hard enough. On the flip side, on the right side, you see the macroaggressions, the intentional macroaggressions, and then the unintentional macroaggressions. Again, the macroaggressions are really in-your-face statements that people believe based on the water that they've been in. So I want to share something with you that, as the name suggests, microaggressions seem small, but compounded over time, they really have a detrimental impact on the experience, whether it be a colleague or whether it be your students. And it can really impact physical and psychological and physiological health. And in fact, research suggests that subtle forms of interpersonal discrimination, like microaggressions, are at least as harmful as more overt expressions of discrimination. They reinforce white privilege and undermine a culture of inclusion. And the best solution, of course, is increasing awareness of microaggressions, insisting that people stop committing to. So here it is. On the opposite end, you have macroaggressions, which is defined as an act of racism towards everyone of that race. I gave an example a little earlier. All Black people come from impoverished communities. Dictated to a central race, that becomes a macroaggression. And so I want to share an experience with you and get away from the notes for a minute. And I certainly welcome your feedback and your questions around this. But recently, somebody shared a microaggression with me. And this is what they said. You were so articulate. At the time I heard it, I kind of cringed on the inside because I've heard it before. And it bothered me because previously, when I had heard it, it was with the idea, and it was a signal for me, that Black people aren't usually capable of intellectual conversation. They don't know how to use a noun and a verb in good grammar and structure. And so when I heard it, I didn't respond. Because in my mind, there were three ways I could have handled that. One, I could have responded instantly. But when I heard it, I was emotional. I never want to give the impression that I'm an angry black man. So I never respond right away. And that's a strategy, not an act of cowardice. Because I understand that a lot of times I need to go sit on it and de-stress, because if I interpret it the wrong way, then I've just violated and I've just become a hypocrite of the advice that I just gave you, and that is to sit at the table. But if I respond to you immediately and I'm angry, now I've set the tone for everybody else who's looking that you can't say anything to Andre Morgan because he'll negatively respond and he'll get angry. And what that will do is make you quiet and push you back away from the table. So option one was to not say anything. Or actually, option one was to say something immediately. I didn't go with that option. Option number two was to sleep on it and come back and address it on another day. Fortunately, I knew I was going to see this person that following day. And so I addressed it after I had an opportunity to calm down from how I interpreted it. The third option was to not say anything at all. And I'll be honest, I've heard microaggressions and have let it go. But as I've gotten more evolved in my practice, and I've started to think about the impact that I want to make, I'm no longer in a place where I'll just let it slide and push it under the carpet. And neither should you. So I took option number two. I came back, I had a conversation, and I started by saying, I heard something that I want to get your feedback on. Yesterday, this is what you said to me. This is how I interpreted it. What was your intent? And actually, let me change that, because I asked for the intent before I said this is how I interpreted it. And I asked it in a very non-threatening way. What was your intent? Sometimes when we deal with microaggressions, we think that we're going to hear something that's going to soothe our egos, satisfy the soul, and then we're going to sing Kumbaya and go on with our day. But then sometimes you'll hear something that'll really jolt you, and this is where it opens up the door. So this person and I sat down. I asked the initial prompt. I asked what their intent was. And they said to me, well, I just wanted to acknowledge that, you know, I felt like you were like the most articulate black person I've come across. I thought this isn't the time to like go to the top of the ladder again, or the ladder of inference, which is another form for using the ladder. But I said, here's an opportunity to open the door. So then I said, all right, what's been your experience with black people? And she was honest, and she shared it. And you know what? We were at the table together, and that conversation opened itself up to another conversation where we had an honest and frank conversation about race, about racism, about our experiences. And that's important. That's what I mean when I talk about coming to the table. So it's not just coming to the table as a white person to talk about microaggressions and race and racism and diversity and belonging. But as a black man, it means I come to the table the same way. It means that even if we sit down and we have diverse differences and we get up from the table and we still think the same way, we've at least had the conversation with each other. And perhaps we'll continue to have more conversations, because in my mind, and also in the other person's mind, we are now changing our perceptions about each other. And so maybe in the course of the experience, you learn something about me that shapes the way you think about people of color. And likewise, I learned something about you that shapes the way I think about the group that you belong to. And so coming to the table is pivotal. It's not a joyful lunch chit chat, but it's an important one. And so what I'd like to encourage you to do is come to the table. Some of you might not want to come to the table, and you're not ready to come to the table today. But hopefully, as we begin to interact and partner with each other, you'll feel a little more comfortable to come sit and share how you feel. I think this is what starts having difficult conversations. Because when you can have one conversation civilly, without yelling and screaming and getting emotionally attached to what somebody else said, then you can really get down to the business of really beginning to shape and change ideological oppression. And don't you know a conversation or two conversations can change institutional policies? Don't you know it can change the way interpersonal oppression manifests? And certainly it deals with the internalized piece too, because by sitting down, now I feel like you're at least interested in what I have to say, and that together we can talk through our differences. We don't have to leave the table agreeing, but the fact that we can talk about it is important. And I think that that's what families expect us to do, to be able to talk about it without being afraid or without being emotionally charged. That's how we begin to move the needle in the education sector. All right, so I want to take a couple of minutes for questions because I see a few that have come through. And I want to spend a few moments on that, and then I'm going to go to our last part and talk about our debrief question that will start up in about 10 minutes. All right, Judy, what questions do we have?
I'm noticing there's a lot of discussion going on. It's hard to follow. You're definitely having an impact. Being fearful of saying the wrong thing and wondering, somebody just asked a question about, did you ever think it was a microaggression, but it wasn't? I mean, is there misinterpretations on both sides?
So the long and short of it, before I became really engaged in this work and understood the idea of oppression, yes, I experienced microaggressions that were intended to be very different. So that's why I shared how I handled this last situation. Not only does it demonstrate my growth, I think, to a large degree, but I think that that's the way that you understand intent, by asking, what was your intent? And then from there, the conversation can evolve, if you will. Dr. Flaherty, I know you have a question.
I'm going to take a step up the ladder.
Okay, come on with me.
And it actually builds off of what Judy just asked. So it's difficult to have some of the conversations when you're afraid that what you say may be misinterpreted. So the question that I have for you is around the microaggression, and how do you come to the table and be open to have conversations when you, I think they said it, are afraid of how that will be interpreted? Because as I was sitting listening to your story, I was thinking, I can't wait till this is over, because this is the first time I've seen Andre present, and I can't wait to tell him what a great presentation it is, and that I think that you're incredibly articulate. And it was meant completely as a compliment, and I would have never have imagined or thought of it as being a microaggression. So how do we either retool our thinking, or how do we feel comfortable to come and have a conversation when you're always thinking in the back of your mind, how will this be interpreted?
Great question.
May I interrupt? Can you rephrase a little? We're not sure the audience could hear your question.
So the question rephrased.
Okay, so I asked on the chat. I think people could hear. We can hear. Okay.
All right. So I was silent for a few minutes because I was listening to the question, and I understand that some folks may have had problems hearing the question. And so to Dr. Flaherty's question, I always start the conversation by saying, and this is something that you can apply as a strategy when you want to have a difficult conversation. I sometimes start by saying, I may not say this in the right way, but here's my intent. This is a new area for me, and I hope that you can receive and be receptive to what I'm going to say. And so when you begin to couch it with a little bit of an intro, if you will, it changes people's perception and they're not immediately on the defensive. All right, do we have another question? All right, thanks for your patience, folks, as we're scrolling down. There's a lot of comments and questions, and that's great. Thank you for being engaged, and thank you for joining us on the ladder this morning. We're just trying to make sure that we address as much of your questions as possible before we head to school debrief.
We have a question from Ryan. You mentioned in your new role, racism and equity, studying data on both race and gender. There are conversations that could be had regarding equity in the domain gender. I'm curious how this would work.
All right, so the race and gender piece of the equation are only components. It's not the entire piece that I'm looking at. When I talk about raising inequities and looking at data to inform how we deal with groups of students, that includes a wide array of students. So it's not limited, Ryan, it is more expansive. And so while I won't have the magic bullet for every subgroup, we are going to be looking at wider subgroups.
Someone just asked how we might recruit a more diverse group of teachers to our district.
So I don't think there's a magic bullet response to that question, Elizabeth. I think many districts are asking the same questions. How do you recruit more people to the district? I think when you begin looking at recruiting for diverse talent, you got to think about, are there measures in place that would be attractive to a diverse candidate pool? You know, what is it that would make someone come to Beverly Public Schools? And so I'll use my own example. When the offer came through and I talked it over, you know, with a few thought partners, the one thing that everybody said was, how comfortable would you be going into a predominantly white school district? And for me, that hadn't been an issue, but I think it hadn't been an issue because I had gotten exposed to Beverly while I was a resident at Harvard. And so understanding the district context, being able to connect with people in the district, had given me a personal upfront knowledge that my sounding board could not give me. Now, that doesn't mean that that was the reason I got the offer. I'm just sharing how I got the context for the district. And so to answer your question, Elizabeth, how do you make the district more attractive to diverse talent? You got to do it through a couple of different ways. There has to be a notion that people are practicing areas of anti-racism, that the district is welcoming, that these are the support measures that are in place. And then you've got to be intentional about recruiting diverse staff. Like, you've got to go into the markets where those diverse staff are. And so it means that you've got to go outside of a Beverly. You've got to go into more pockets where you will find more people who would add to the diversity. And so that's just the honest part of the question. But there are different ways that can be done. And it just depends on the district strategy.
People are appreciating the concrete examples you've given. And I think that Colleen's asking for more examples of microaggressions that we might be inflicting on our students. I'm kind of scared to ask, but curious from your perspective.
All right, so I will share this because I know we are looking at 5 more minutes, and I want to talk about our school debrief for a couple of minutes and then give folks a break before they go into their school meetings. But I will share this. I am actually in my choice board, which is going to be a Zoom call. I'll talk a little more about the microaggressions, and I'll give more examples, and we'll also do a role play. But to answer your question, Colleen, some other microaggressions that you might hear, you might think about. when you make comments about a student's hair, you might see a student who has cornrows, or her hair might be particularly big in a certain way. Comments around, wow, your hair is really big today. It's not malicious intent, but it lands a little differently. So if you're saying that to a young female student of color about her hair being big, you know, the interpretation could be, are you planning to keep your hair in that style? Are you going to wear that tomorrow? That's kind of the subliminal message. So one example. All right, 9:27, I want to go to our school debrief. All of the schools will be operating off of one question for the debrief. And that is, what assumptions do we hold about groups of students, such as, but not limited to, students who are low income, of color, with disabilities, and who speak English as a second language. And throughout the course of this talk today, I tried to really lay out the direction for what the school debrief is going to be. 30 minutes is a short window of time, but I trust that in your school debriefs, and this will be an introductory discussion that will continue beyond today and into your staff meetings, into the culture of the particular school. But what you really want to unpack is, what's the real deal? What's the honesty behind what you think about students who have some difference? And I believe that these school debriefs, I wish I could join a couple of them, but I think that they're going to be real profound because it's an opportunity to really talk about what matters in the culture of that school and to talk about any inequities, even in our biases unintentionally, that have gotten levied to students. What is it that we do that makes or breaks the experience? What do we do that shapes how students perceive what they're getting from Beverly Public Schools? What's the experience we're going to offer such that down the line, when that example is recounted, that they won't say that my experience at Beverly Public Schools was horrible, and they call you by name. And many of us have that experience. And as I'm talking about it, I'm thinking about a good 5 teachers off the top of my head who my life might have been much better as a youngster had I never interfaced with them. It's not an indictment, it's just honesty, and it is what it is. And so at this particular juncture, I'm going to assume that we can save the messages in the chat. And if we can, I will make every effort. I won't fully commit to this, but I'll make every effort to go through the chat and address some of the questions that we didn't get to address today. The school debrief is an opportunity for us to really do the initial work around the 4 eyes of oppression. How is the ideological piece manifesting in what we're doing on a day-to-day basis? How is that reflected in the institution of our school, in the district? How are we interpersonalizing it? How are students internalizing it? How are our colleagues internalizing it? All of those things are going to make your conversations with each other, with students, with families, that much more instructive and less difficult. Thank you for your time.
Lots of thank yous to you, Dr. Morgan, from everybody.
My
in the
joy.
chat.
Feel free to reach out. I'm available to each of you.
Andre, will you make the slides available? People wanted to know.
Yes, I will make the slides available, and I guess, Dr. Flaherty, I'll send them to you to send out.
Yes.
Okay, that'll work. Thanks much. Enjoy the school debrief.